The dust of Promise Creek tasted of grit and failure. It coated the back of Silas's throat, a familiar bitterness he had not missed in his years on the mountain. He stood by the assayer's office, a leather pouch heavy with gold dust in his hand, feeling the press of too many bodies, the stink of unwashed men and cheap whiskey. The town was a wound, a raw gash carved into the foothills, and he only ever came down when necessity clawed at him. He saw them then. A ripple in the grimy human tide. Two small figures, girls, standing beside the platform of the newly arrived train. They were identical, with shining black hair pulled into tight knots and faces pale with a fear so profound it seemed to steal the very air around them. They clutched each other's hands, a single, four-handed fist against the world. Their clothes, simple cotton tunics and trousers, were clean but foreign, marking them as other, as objects of curiosity and suspicion. A man in a crisp suit, a railroad man by his bowler hat and polished boots, stood over them. Mr. Thornton. His voice was a smooth, oily thing that slid over the crowd's murmurs. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand, tapping them against his thigh with an air of absolute ownership. He was not speaking to the children, he was speaking about them, as a rancher might speak about new livestock. Silas felt a cold, dead thing in his chest stir. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass under the skin. A small hand in his. A cascade of bright laughter. The scent of wood smoke and wild roses. He pushed it down, hard. That part of his life was over, buried under a mound of stones on a high, lonely ridge where the wind never stopped mourning. He had come for salt, for flour, for steel traps. He had not come for this. He had not come for the sight of two lost children being sold like sacks of grain. The railroad man was talking about indenture, about passage owed, a debt to be worked off. He used fine, legal words, but the meaning was ugly and plain. Slavery, by another name. The girls, Mai and Lin, did not understand the words, but they understood the tone. They understood the cold, appraising eyes of the men in the crowd. They had traveled for weeks in darkness, first in the belly of a great ship, then in a rattling, stinking train car. Their parents had put them on the ship with promises of a new life, a golden mountain. But the people who met them were not family. They were men with hard eyes and ledgers, who took their papers and gave them new ones, papers they could not read. Mai, the older by a few minutes, squeezed her sister's hand tighter. She watched the tall, quiet man standing near the assayer's office. He was different from the others. He was not staring at them with greed or cruel amusement. He was staring with a stillness that was more frightening than any shout, a stillness that seemed to hold a terrible sadness. His face was weathered, bearded, but his eyes were a clear, sharp grey, like the sky before a snowstorm. A 10-year contract, Mr. Thornton announced, his voice booming with satisfaction. To any man with a respectable business. Strong backs for light work, mending, cleaning. A bargain for the industrious. No one moved. The townspeople were hard, but most were not cruel. They looked at the tiny, trembling girls and saw something that unsettled them. A line had been crossed. This was not the promise that had brought them west. Silas felt the cold thing in his chest break open. It was not memory now. It was rage. A clean, quiet rage that burned through him, melting the ice of years of solitude. He saw his own daughter, lost to the fever. He saw his wife, her face pale in the moonlight as she drew her last breath. He had failed to protect them. He would not fail again. The pouch of gold dust was heavy in his hand. It represented months of back-breaking work, of solitude and freezing streams. It was his future. His security. His means to remain alone. He took a step forward. Then another. The crowd parted for him, sensing the shift in the air. He was a known figure in Promise Creek, but not a welcome one. The mountain man. A ghost who came and went with the seasons, speaking little, buying his goods, and vanishing back into the high peaks where sane men did not go. He stopped directly in front of Mr. Thornton. He was taller than the railroad man by a head, wider by a foot. The dust of the mountains clung to him, an earthy, wild scent that overpowered Thornton's cheap cologne. "What is their debt?" Silas's voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. Thornton was taken aback. He straightened his waistcoat, trying to reclaim his authority. "This is a company matter. A legal contract." "The debt," Silas repeated. The words were not a question. They were a demand. Thornton, unnerved by the man's intensity, glanced at his papers. He named a figure, an exorbitant sum meant to sound impressive and final. Without a word, Silas untied the leather pouch. He poured the glittering gold dust onto the assayer's scale right there on the boardwalk. The crowd murmured. It was a fortune. More than enough. He did not wait for the assayer to give the final weight. He looked at Thornton, his grey eyes like chips of flint. "Their debt is paid," Silas said. He did not look at the gold. He looked at the girls. He extended a large, calloused hand, palm up. It was not a command. It was an offer. "Come." Mai looked at the hand. It was scarred and rough, but it was steady. It was not the hand of a man who dealt in papers and oily words. She looked up at his face, at the raw grief in his eyes, and saw something she had not seen in a very long time. She saw safety. She took a hesitant step, pulling her sister Lynn with her. She placed her small hand in his. Lynn followed, placing her hand on top of Mai's. His grip was surprisingly gentle as it closed around them. "These children are property of the Transcontinental Railroad Company." Thornton sputtered, his face red with fury and humiliation. "You have no right." "I have papers." Silas did not even look at him. He turned and, holding the girl's hands, began to walk away from the platform, away from the town, towards the rising slope of the mountain. The crowd watched in stunned silence, a collective breath held in the dusty air. They had just witnessed something more binding than any paper contract. They had witnessed an act of sheer, unadorned will. The journey up the mountain was silent. The path was steep and rugged, a trail only Silas and the wild creatures knew. He had expected the girls to struggle, to cry, but they did not. They walked with a grim determination that spoke of a resilience forged in hardship. He shortened his stride to match theirs, his large hand a warm, solid anchor in their small ones. From Mai's perspective, the world had become a dizzying landscape of rock and pine. The air grew thinner, cleaner, scented with things she had never smelled before. The man did not speak. He simply moved, a force of nature like the wind in the trees. She was afraid, but it was a different kind of fear now. It was not the helpless, caged fear of the train, but the cautious fear of the unknown. She watched his back, the steady set of his shoulders, and felt a flicker of something she could not name. It felt like trust. They reached his cabin as dusk was bleeding purple and orange across the sky. It was a simple structure, built of sturdy logs, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of smoke. It looked as if it had grown out of the mountainside itself. Inside, a fire was banked in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow on the spare wooden furniture. There was a table, 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner. It was a place built for one. Silas released their hands and moved with quiet efficiency. He added wood to the fire, filled a kettle with water from a bucket, and set a pot of something to heat over the flames. He did not fuss over them. He simply created a space of warmth and order. He took 2 tin cups from a shelf and poured them water. Then he ladled a thick, savory stew into 2 bowls and set them on the table. Mai and Lynn sat on the floor near the fire, their small bodies still rigid with uncertainty. They had not been offered food without a price for a long time. Silas pushed the bowls closer to them with the toe of his boot, a gesture that was somehow less intimidating than using his hands. He sat in one of the chairs, his back to them, and ate his own meal in silence. Hesitantly, Mai picked up her bowl. The stew was rich with venison and wild vegetables. It was the first truly hot meal she had eaten in weeks. She and Lynn ate quickly, their eyes darting around the small, safe room. When they were finished, Silas took their bowls without a word and refilled them. Later, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Silas sat at the table, a small block of pine and a knife in his hands. He worked silently, the blade moving with practiced skill. Shavings fell to the floor like soft curls of snow. I watched, fascinated. The sharp angles of the wood softened, taking on a familiar shape. He was carving a bird. A crane with long legs and a delicate neck. He carved a second one, identical to the first. He finished them, rubbing them smooth with a piece of worn leather. He did not look at the girls. He simply placed the two small wooden cranes on the hearth, near where they sat. A gift, offered without condition. I crept forward and picked one up. It was smooth and warm from the firelight. She traced the lines of its wings with her finger. Lynn took the other. They held the small birds in their hands, the first beautiful things they had owned in a lifetime. Silas got up and went to a large wooden chest at the foot of his bed. He opened it. The scent of dried lavender and cedar drifted out. He reached inside and pulled out a small, folded quilt. It was made of soft, faded squares of calico. He laid it on the floor near the hearth, creating a pallet for them. As he straightened up, a small object fell from the folds of the quilt. A child's dress, made of the same faded calico, small enough for a girl their age. He froze. His face, illuminated by the fire, was a mask of such profound, gut-wrenching pain that I flinched. He snatched the dress up quickly, his movements jerky, and shoved it back into the chest, slamming the lid shut. He stood with his back to them for a long moment, his shoulders shaking almost imperceptibly. He did not make a sound, but I knew he was crying. In that moment, her fear of him vanished completely. It was replaced by a wave of empathy so strong it made her own eyes sting. This large, silent, sad man was not a monster. He was wounded. Just like them. She lay down on the soft quilt, her wooden crane clutched in her hand, and for the first time since leaving her home, she felt the possibility of sleep without nightmares. Silas stood at the window, watching the moon rise over the jagged peaks. The pain was a physical thing, a hand squeezing his heart. The dress. Anna's dress. He had not looked at it in 5 years. Seeing it again, seeing the smallness of it near those two living, breathing children, had shattered the dam he had so carefully built around his grief. He had brought them into his sanctuary, his fortress of solitude. He had done it on instinct, a blind, protective reflex. But now, in the quiet of the night, the reality of it settled on him. He had 2 children in his care. 2 children who had been bought and sold. 2 children who were now his responsibility. And the man who had sold them, Mr. Thornton, was not the type to let such a public humiliation go unanswered. Trouble was coming down the mountain. He knew it as surely as he knew the feel of the coming winter. A week passed in quiet routine. Silas hunted and chopped wood. The girls explored the small meadow around the cabin, never straying far. They spoke to each other in their own language, their voices like the soft chirping of birds. They were still wary, but the sharp edges of their fear were softening. They left small gifts for him on the porch, a brightly colored feather, a smooth river stone, a tiny bouquet of wildflowers. He, in turn, left them small carvings by the hearth each night, a deer, a fox, a bear. The peace was broken by the sight of a rider coming up the trail. It was Jed, the blacksmith's boy, his face flushed with exertion. He carried a message from Elspeth, the widow who ran the general store. Mr. Thornton was back in Promise Creek. And he had brought the law with him. Silas's jaw tightened. He had known this was coming. He read Elspeth's note. Thornton had filed a formal complaint with the territorial marshal. He was accusing Silas of theft and kidnapping. He had official documents from the railroad, claiming the girls were indentured laborers who had absconded. A hearing was set for 3 days' time. "He says you stole company property," Jed relayed breathlessly. "And he's telling everyone you're a wild man, unfit to care for children. Some folks are listening, Silas. They're scared of you." Silas nodded, his face grim. He thanked the boy and sent him on his way with a piece of jerky for the ride back. He turned and looked at Mai and Lin, who were watching him with wide, worried eyes. They did not understand the words, but they understood the tension that had suddenly descended on their safe haven. He knew he could not leave them on the mountain. They were the heart of the matter. Their presence was his only real defense. The thought of bringing them back to that dusty, hostile town made his stomach churn. But there was no choice. He packed a small bag with food, water, and the calico quilt. "We go," he said, his voice low. They journeyed back down the mountain, the mood somber and heavy with dread. When they reached the outskirts of Promise Creek, the atmosphere was palpably different. Doors closed as they passed. Faces turned away. Thornton had poisoned the well, preying on the town's fear of the unknown, fear of the mountain man, fear of the strange, silent children. Silas went straight to Elspeth's mercantile. The bell over the door chimed, a cheerful sound at odds with his mood. Elspeth was a stout woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She had been a friend to his wife, years ago. She was one of the few people in town he trusted. She took one look at his face, then at the two small girls hiding behind his legs, and ushered them into the back room, away from prying eyes. She gave the girls a peppermint stick each and sat them on a stack of flour sacks. "Here's a venomous snake, that Thornton," she said, her voice tight with anger. "He's been preening all over town, waving his papers around like scripture. He says the girls' passage was recorded in the company ledgers, a debt against their labor." Silas leaned against the wall, the weight of it all pressing down on him. "His papers are lies." "I know," Elspeth said softly. "And so do you. But the magistrate, Judge Hemlock, is a man who respects paper. He respects the railroad. We need more than your word against Thornton." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've heard talk. Thornton does more than just transport laborers. He has another book. A private ledger. One where he records the real transactions, the cash sales he pockets himself. It's where he keeps track of the people he treats like property." A spark ignited in Silas's eyes. Evidence. Something tangible to fight the lies. Where? The railroad office. He keeps it locked in his desk. He's too arrogant to think anyone would dare look for it, Elspeth said. But getting it? Silas, it's too dangerous. If you're caught, it will only prove everything he's been saying about you. Silas looked over at Mai and Lin. They were nibbling their peppermint sticks, their dark eyes full of a quiet, watchful intelligence. He had to try. For them. The next 2 days were a quiet battle for the soul of the town. Silas, guided by Elspeth, did not hide. He walked through Promise Creek with the girls at his side. He went to the blacksmith, a man named Gunnar, to have his horse reshod. Gunnar was gruff, his initial glances at the girls suspicious. Heard you caused a stir, Gunnar grunted, not looking up from his work. Thornton lied, Silas said simply. Just then, Lin stumbled on a loose stone. Before Silas could react, she scraped her knee. She did not cry out, but her face crumpled, tears welling in her eyes. Mai immediately knelt beside her, whispering in their language, gently wiping the dust from the wound. It was a small, intimate moment of sisterly care. Gunnar stopped hammering. He watched the two little girls, the fierce tenderness between them. He looked at Silas, who stood over them like a worried sentinel. He grunted again, but the sound was different. A man who protects children ain't a thief, he said, and went back to his anvil with renewed vigor. Word of the small incident spread. The baker's wife saw them next. She came out of her shop, her hands white with flour, and looked at the girls. She saw not company property, but 2 scared children. She disappeared back inside and returned with 2 warm sugar cookies, which she pressed into their hands. These small acts of kindness were cracks in the wall of suspicion Thornton had built. People began to see with their own eyes. They saw the way Silas moved around the girls, a gentle giant, his hands that could break rock now used to steady a small shoulder or point out a bird in the sky. They saw the way the girls were beginning to relax in his presence, their hands no longer permanently clasped together, but sometimes reaching for his. From Mai's perspective, the town was a confusing place of shifting moods. First, there had been cold shoulders and angry glares. Now, there were hesitant smiles and small gifts. She trusted the man, Silas. He was their mountain. Solid, quiet, unmovable. But she could feel his tension, the worry that called in him as the day of the hearing approached. That night, in the small room behind Elspeth's door, Silas taught them a game with pebbles, a simple game of counting and patterns. Mai, in a burst of confidence, picked up a piece of charcoal from the kindling box and began to draw on a scrap of butcher paper. She drew their mountain cabin, with the tall pines and the smoke curling from the chimney. She drew 3 figures standing outside. 1 very large, and 2 very small. She slid the drawing across the table to Silas. He looked at it for a long time. His throat grew thick. It was a picture of a family. A home. He folded it carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, over his heart. He knew what he had to do. That night, while the town slept, he would visit the railroad office. The office was dark, a block of shadow against a star-dusted sky. Silas moved like a ghost, a skill honed by years of hunting in the high country. The lock on the back window was cheap, easily broken. He slipped inside, the air thick with the smell of ink and old steel. He found the desk Elspeth had described. It was locked. He did not bother trying to pick it. He gripped the edges and, with a great, controlled surge of strength, ripped the entire drawer out of the desk. The wood splintered with a sharp crack. Inside, beneath a stack of shipping manifests, was a small, black, leather-bound book. The ledger. He opened it. The pages were filled with Thornton's neat, precise script. Names, dates, and figures. But these were not records of passage owed. They were records of sales. Human beings, listed next to cash amounts, like entries for timber or coal. He found their names. Mai and Lin. Beside them was a figure and the notation, sold to Promise Creek Mining Consortium. It was a lie built on a deeper, more damnable truth. He had not been planning to indenture them, he had been planning to sell them to the mining company for a private, illegal profit. He took the ledger and slipped back into the night, as unseen as he had arrived. The town hall was packed. Every chair was filled, and men stood 3 deep along the walls. The air was thick with anticipation. Judge Hemlock, a stern man with a drooping mustache, sat at a heavy oak table at the front, flanked by the territorial marshal. Mr. Thornton sat at one side, looking smug and confident, his stack of official papers neatly arranged before him. Silas sat at the other, with Mai and Lin on a small bench beside him. Elspeth stood behind them, a pillar of quiet support. Thornton presented his case first. He spoke with practiced eloquence, his voice resonating with false sincerity. He portrayed the railroad as a benevolent entity, providing passage to a new life. He painted Silas as a feral, dangerous recluse who had stolen valuable company assets. He held up his documents, the official seals glinting in the lamplight. "The law is clear, Your Honor," he concluded, gesturing to the girls. "These children represent a significant investment by the Transcontinental Railroad. They are bound by contract, a debt they must repay. This man," he sneered, pointing at Silas, "stole them. It is a simple matter of property rights." The judge nodded grimly. He looked at Silas. "Mr. Silas, you have a response?" Silas stood. He was not an eloquent man. He placed the black ledger on the table. "He is lying." Thornton laughed, a short, ugly bark. "The ravings of an illiterate poacher. My documents are certified." "What is that?" "Some trapper's diary." "It is your ledger," Silas said, his voice level. "Your real one." He opened it to the page with the girls' names. "It says you sold them." "Not indentured them." "Sold them." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Thornton's face went pale. "That is a forgery." A fabrication. Judge Hemlock took the ledger and began to read. His face grew darker with every page. The room was silent, the only sound the rustle of paper. "These are serious accusations, Mr. Thornton," the judge said, his voice like ice. "These are lists of people. Sold. Lies." Thornton shrieked, his composure shattering. "That book is a lie. Ask the children. They were given passage, food, shelter. They owe a debt." He pointed a shaking finger at Mai. "You. Tell them. Tell them you belong to the railroad." All eyes turned to Mai. She shrank back, her heart hammering against her ribs. The whole world was looking at her. She felt Silas's hand rest gently on her shoulder, a warm, steady weight. It was not a push, but an anchor. She looked at her sister, Lynn, who nodded, her eyes wide with trust. She looked at Elspeth's kind, encouraging face. Mai stood up. Her voice, when it came, was small, a fragile thread in the heavy silence. She spoke in the halting English she had learned from listening to Elspeth and Silas. "No," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Not belong." She looked directly at Thornton, her dark eyes holding his. "He put us in dark room. No food. Cold." Then she turned and looked at Silas. Her face softened. "This man," she said, her voice clear and true, "gave us fire. Gave us food. Gave us home." It was a child's simple truth, but it struck the room with the force of a thunderclap. It was more powerful than any legal document, more damning than any ledger. It was pure, unassailable fact. The crowd erupted. Not in a roar, but in a low, angry growl. The blacksmith, Gunnar, stood up. "That's enough. We've heard enough." The baker's wife stood, then the assayer, then a dozen more. They were standing with Silas. They were standing for the children. The community had made its choice. The marshal stepped forward and placed a heavy hand on Thornton's shoulder. "Mr. Thornton, you're under arrest. For fraud, and for human trafficking." Thornton's face collapsed into a mask of disbelief and terror. As he was led away, disgraced and defeated, the townspeople surrounded Silas and the girls. Not with suspicion now, but with open admiration and warmth. Elspeth wrapped her arms around both girls, her face wet with tears. The community, once a source of fear, had become a shield. The journey back up the mountain was different. The silence was not tense, but peaceful. The weight that had settled on Silas's shoulders for years felt lighter, as if the wind itself were helping to carry it away. He walked between the two girls, their hands held firmly in his. They were not his prisoners, and he was not their rescuer. They were simply three people, walking home. That evening, the fire in the cabin hearth seemed warmer, the small space brighter. They ate their stew in comfortable silence. Afterwards, Mai and Lynn did not immediately go to their pallet. They stood before Silas, who sat in his chair, watching the flames. They stood side by side, their faces serious, as if they had practiced this. Mai spoke, her voice still soft, but filled with a new, quiet confidence. She looked at the floor, then up at his face, her gaze direct and unwavering. "You," she began, pointing a small finger at his chest. She paused, searching for the word she and Lynn had whispered about all the way up the mountain. She found it. "You or father." The word struck Silas with the force of a physical blow. Father. A name he had not heard directed at him in 5 long, empty years. A name he thought was buried forever with his heart on that windy ridge. It broke through the walls of his grief, shattered the ice of his solitude, and washed over him in a tidal wave of emotion he was powerless to stop. His weathered face crumpled. A deep, wrenching sob tore from his chest, a sound of pure, undiluted agony and release. Tears streamed down his face, carving clean paths through the grime and stubble. He covered his face with his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with the force of his weeping. He cried for the wife he had lost, for the daughter he could not save. He cried for the years of lonely silence. And he cried for the incredible, terrifying, beautiful hope that was blooming in the ruins of his heart. Mai and Lin did not run. They did not seem scared by his sudden breakdown. They stepped forward, and with a shared, unspoken understanding, they wrapped their tiny arms around his legs. They leaned their heads against his knees, holding onto him as he had held onto them. He felt their small, warm bodies against him, a tangible, living comfort. After a long time, the storm of his grief began to subside. He lowered his hands, his eyes red and raw, and looked at the two girls clinging to him. He reached down and cupped their faces in his large, trembling hands. "Yes," he whispered, his voice thick and broken. "Yes." A new life began on the mountain. It was a life built not on blood or law, but on choice and shared healing. Silas taught them the names of the trees and the tracks of the animals. They, in turn, filled his silent cabin with soft chatter and quiet laughter. One sunny afternoon, he took them to the high ridge where two simple stone markers stood. He did not tell them who was buried there, not in words. He simply stood with them, a hand on each of their shoulders. Mai, with an instinct that transcended language, laid the small bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered at the base of the stones. A bridge between what was lost and what had been found. Promise Creek became a part of their lives. Once a month, they would travel down the mountain, not as outcasts, but as family. Elspeth would have packages of cloth and sugar waiting for them. Gunnar the blacksmith would lift the girls onto his broad shoulders for a laugh. The community, having found its conscience, had also found its heart. They were no longer just the mountain man and the strange railroad children. They were Silas and his daughters, a testament to the fact that the strongest families are often the ones you build yourself, forged in the fire of kindness and sheltered by the courage of a loving heart.